The Dark Scrolls. It begins in a chamber heavy with the scent of incense and fear, a place no one expected would one day shape the destiny of an empire. She was not born to rule, she wasn't even born to be remembered. Wu Zhao was just the daughter of a lumber merchant, a girl of no consequence, her birth barely worthy of a record in the family register. Yet she had something far rarer than noble blood, a hunger so relentless that it would devour everything in her path. From her earliest days, the court gossips whispered that her eyes were too bright, her voice too confident for a mere concubine's child. They said she watched people the way a predator studied prey. When she was only 14, she was summoned to the imperial palace to serve as a low-ranking concubine of Emperor Taizong. To most girls, this would have been the pinnacle of fortune: silken robes, perfumed baths, meals carried on golden trays. But to Wu Zhao, it was nothing more than the first rung on the ladder, and she would climb until she stood alone at the top. The emperor was a hard, suspicious man, and he rarely noticed the quiet girl who lingered at the edges of his harem. She learned how to be invisible, how to smile without revealing ambition, how to obey without surrendering her will. In those early years, she did not dare to act, but she watched everything: who held the emperor's ear, who spread rumors, who betrayed whom. When Taizong grew ill, she was there, offering bowls of medicine and cool cloths for his fever. Some said she even tried to seduce him in his final days, to secure a place in his testament. If that was true, it failed, because when Taizong died, she was ordered, like all the emperor's childless concubines, to enter a Buddhist convent and take vows. Most women in her position accepted this as the end. Wu Zhao saw it as a temporary exile. She waited in her gray robes, listening for any rumor of a chance to return. And it came, carried on the whisper of scandal. The new emperor, Gaozong, had once glanced at her with interest during his father's reign. Now he was young, lonely, and increasingly ill himself. When he came to the convent to offer prayers, she arranged to cross his path. Their eyes met again. In that instant, a secret understanding was born between them. She would be whatever he needed: lover, comforter, confidant, and in return he would lift her from obscurity. When she returned to court as Gao Zong's concubine, the other women sneered. They called her a fallen nun, a tainted woman unworthy of the emperor's touch. But they underestimated how cunning she had become in her years of watching. She studied her rivals with a fascination that was almost scientific. She learned their vanities, their secrets, the hidden fractures in their alliances, and then she exploited them one by one. No story about Wu Zhao can ignore the most chilling rumor: that she smothered her own newborn daughter, then accused the Empress of murder. Whether this is truth or slander, it worked. The emperor was horrified. The Empress, already vulnerable, was cast aside in disgrace. Wu Zhao took her place, becoming Empress consort, the first woman in living memory to rise from such humble beginnings to such power. The palace seethed with resentment, but Gao Zong was bewitched by her. He could not bring himself to deny her anything, and so she began to rule. At first, it was from behind the silk screens, giving counsel, drafting edicts the emperor would sign without reading. But as Gao Zong's health declined, she grew bolder. Soon ministers came to her directly, bowing low and addressing her as though she were already sovereign. She reveled in it, the knowledge that she, a merchant's daughter, was reshaping history. Yet even this was not enough. She dreamed of standing alone at the pinnacle of power, unchallenged, undisputed. Her reign as Empress consort was marked by a paradoxical mixture of cruelty and vision. She was relentless in eliminating any threat, real or imagined, to her authority. Courtiers disappeared overnight. Princes were exiled or forced to commit suicide. The court's most powerful families began to cower. Yet while her enemies fell, she also began reforms that would strengthen the empire. She opened the examination system to men of humble birth. She rewarded competence over pedigree, and she nurtured Buddhist institutions that offered an alternative to the old Confucian aristocracy, cementing a base of support that transcended class. Still, no matter how many rivals she outmaneuvered, she remained a woman in a man's world. Every gesture, every policy was scrutinized through the lens of gender. They called her a harlot, a usurper, a serpent in human form. But their outrage only hardened her resolve. She would not be content until she claimed the dragon throne itself. Behind her ambition was also an insatiable appetite for affection. Her relationship with Emperor Gaozong was more than a political alliance. He was deeply infatuated, some said enslaved by her, and she used his devotion like a weapon. Even as he weakened, she remained vibrantly, disarmingly alive, determined never to return to the shadows. She allowed herself other lovers as well, rumors claimed. Handsome young men she elevated to positions of influence. Scandal and gossip followed her every step. But she was past caring what anyone thought. By the time Emperor Gaozong died, everyone knew she would not relinquish power. They were right. She declared herself regent for her sons, and it was clear she had no intention of ruling from behind the curtain for long. In her heart, she believed she alone was destined to be emperor. This was how the girl no one noticed became the woman everyone feared. And it was only the beginning. The emperor was dead, but Wu Zhao, now Empress Dowager, was more alive than ever. Her ascent to absolute rule was no accident, no stroke of luck. It was the culmination of decades of patient maneuvering, calculated seduction, and unflinching cruelty. Some whispered she had finally revealed her true nature, a woman who had never believed in fate, only in her own will. In the solemn ceremonies honoring Gaozong, she wept before the court, face veiled in white, her cries echoing in the grand hall. But those closest to the palace knew her mourning was a performance, a mask worn to keep the ministers off balance. Even in grief, her gaze was steady, assessing who might oppose her next move. For the first time in Chinese history, a woman would not only act as regent, she would rule as emperor in all but name. It was said that at night she paced her private chambers, maps and ledgers spread across lacquered tables, plotting the future of her dynasty while the rest of the court slept. She installed her sons as puppet emperors, first Zhongzong, then Ruizong, but they were little more than ornamental shields for her ambition. When Zhongzong showed signs of independent thought, she deposed him in a single stroke, banishing him as if he were an unruly child. Even her own blood was expendable if it stood in her way. Outside the palace walls, the empire watched in awe and dread. Common people heard rumors that their ruler, a woman, was not only commanding armies and dictating policy, but taking young lovers into her bed. Two brothers, Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong, became the most notorious. They were beautiful, delicate-featured men who pampered her with poetry and submission. Some said she used them to remind herself that while the world belonged to her, pleasure was hers to command as well. The scandal was immense. No one dared to say a word in her presence. Those who expected her indulgences to weaken her misjudged her completely. While her rivals obsessed over her private affairs, she was reinventing the government itself. She expanded the civil service examination system, opening the doors of the bureaucracy to talent regardless of birth. For the first time, farmers' sons and tradesmen's children competed for posts once reserved for noble families. This transformation sent shockwaves through the aristocracy. She was breaking the old order stone by stone, replacing it with a meritocracy that would outlast her own reign. But her generosity ended where her authority was questioned. She created a vast network of informants, spies hidden among eunuchs, concubines, scribes. A careless remark could become a death sentence. The dungeons beneath the palace grew crowded. Ministers who dared to criticize her disappeared without explanation. She even commissioned a secret police force, the Imperial Censorate, whose agents were empowered to arrest and torture anyone suspected of treason. In the capital, people learned to speak in hushed voices, to keep their eyes on the ground when she passed. Her appetite for dominance extended beyond politics. She was known to invite her favorites into her private apartments, where silk curtains hid what no chronicler dared describe in detail. The Zhang brothers were only the most infamous. Rumors spread that she kept a chamber reserved for intimate liaisons, decorated with candles and lacquered screens, where she would indulge every desire. To her enemies, this was proof she was a debauched tyrant. To her supporters, it was simply one more sign of her absolute freedom. What no one could deny was that her hunger for power, for affection, for supremacy never slackened. In public, she performed her role with a regal composure that defied all conventions. When she appeared in audience halls, she wore golden robes embroidered with dragons, the symbol of the emperor, even though no woman had ever claimed that title. She issued decrees in her own name. She sat alone upon the throne. Every gesture declared what words could not, that she was no regent, no mere dowager. She was the sovereign, and yet, despite the terror she inspired, she was not without vision. Under her rule, trade flourished. The empire's borders were secure. The harvests were good. The treasury brimmed with silver and silk. Even her harshest critics grudgingly admitted that her policies were effective. She patronized Buddhist temples, commissioning grand statues and pagodas, not only to honor her faith but to legitimize her rule. The clergy proclaimed her the incarnation of Maitreya, the future Buddha. This was more than propaganda. It was a spiritual claim to destiny itself. But in the shadows, the resentment grew. Old aristocrats who had watched their privileges erode began to conspire. Confucian scholars, humiliated by her disregard for tradition, whispered that her reign was an abomination against heaven. Her own sons chafed under her unrelenting dominance, longing for the day they might rule in their own right. And through it all, she remained unbowed, convinced that no man, living or dead, could challenge her supremacy. There was something almost inhuman about her certainty, as though she had become an elemental force rather than a woman. And yet, in the quiet hours before dawn, when her lovers slept and her ministers trembled, she was still that girl from a merchant's household, driven by the same ferocious conviction that she was destined to be more than any of them had ever dared imagine. No one could predict how long her reign would last or how it would end. But even her enemies admitted that she had achieved the impossible. She had bent an empire to her will, and she would not relinquish it until it was torn from her dying hands. By the time Wu Zhao was in her 60s, her legend had already eclipsed the truth. Some called her the Dragon Empress, a woman who had stolen the mandate of heaven through cunning and unrelenting audacity. Others whispered she was a monster in human skin, a creature so intoxicated by power she would do anything to keep it. But the one thing no one dared dispute was that her dominion was absolute. Her will was the empire's law. Age did not mellow her appetites. If anything, her final years were a study in extremes, equal parts enlightened reform and unbridled excess. To outsiders, she appeared a woman in complete command of herself. She held daily audiences, signed edicts with a hand that never trembled, and corrected ministers with a scholar's precision. Yet behind the carved screens and brocade curtains, her private life grew more brazen. It was then that the Zhang brothers reached the height of their influence. Zhang Yizhi and Zhang Changzong were her favorites. Young, exquisitely handsome, their skins smooth as lacquer, their voices soft as silk. She elevated them to positions of startling authority, making them the conduits to her power. Any official petition had to pass through their hands. Courtiers came bearing gifts and bribes, desperate for the brothers' favor. Some likened the palace to a brothel masquerading as a throne room. At night, it was said, the Empress would retire to her hidden chamber, lavishly furnished with jade screens, censers spilling perfumed smoke, and beds draped in gauzy silks. There she reveled in pleasures that no chronicler dared record in detail. Some rumors claimed she drank rare elixirs to maintain her vigor, that she experimented with aphrodisiacs distilled from exotic herbs and powdered gemstones. Others insisted she demanded performances of dance and music to stoke her senses before she summoned her lovers to her bed. Those stories, scandalous as they were, only fueled her legend. But while the Zhang brothers were adored by her, they were loathed by nearly everyone else. Ministers seethed at their arrogance, the imperial guards bristled under their commands, and the aristocracy, already devastated by decades of her reforms, saw in them the final insult, a sign that the empire had become little more than an instrument of her personal indulgence. But to Wu Zhao, their devotion was more than carnal pleasure. It was proof she could command love as easily as she commanded armies. She had spent her entire life defying expectations, destroying any who presumed to cage her. Now, in the twilight of her reign, she had surrounded herself with beauty and submission, an empire within the empire, crafted to reflect her singular will. Even as her power appeared unshakable, she was not blind to the forces gathering against her. Her sons, long humiliated and kept in the shadows, had begun to plot her removal. The Confucian scholars she had scorned found common cause with generals disgusted by the decadence of her court, and the people, once grateful for her reforms, grew restless under the weight of corruption and fear. Yet, she refused to retreat. She would not abandon the throne she had claimed with so much cunning and sacrifice. In those last years, her health began to falter. The same woman who had once climbed palace steps with unbreakable determination now required attendants to help her rise from bed. Her hair, once black as ink, turned the color of old snow. Her eyesight failed, and she took to wearing veils even in private audiences, so that no one would see how time had finally marked her. Still, she held court each day, issuing decrees in a voice that remained eerily steady. It was in this fragile moment that her enemies struck. In the winter of 1705, a cabal of officials and palace guards forced their way into the inner chambers. The Zhang brothers were dragged from her side, screaming and pleading. Some said she tried to intervene, but her body betrayed her. She collapsed to the floor as her lovers were butchered in the courtyard. Their blood stained the snow a deep, sickening red. When she awoke, she was no longer the emperor. The conspirators forced her to abdicate in favor of her son, Zhongzong, the same son she had once deposed without a flicker of remorse. As the edict was read aloud, she did not weep. She did not beg. She sat silent, her veiled face tilted toward the floor, as if listening for the echo of the empire she had ruled so absolutely. Her final months were spent in a secluded palace, stripped of all authority. No more spies came to whisper in her ear. No more petitioners knelt to beg her favor. The rooms that had once vibrated with intrigue were now hushed as a tomb. And yet she remained defiant. Visitors reported that even in disgrace, she carried herself with the same imperious bearing. When her son came to pay respects, she reminded him that every honor he enjoyed existed only because she had secured the dynasty's survival. She refused to apologize for any of it. In the end, Wu Zhao died as she had lived, unyielding. On her deathbed, she dictated her own epitaph, forbidding any mention of her crimes or her conquests. She demanded it read only, Zetian, Empress of the Great Zhou. No titles, no apologies, no judgment. Just her name, eternal and unchallenged. Yet her legacy was impossible to erase. She had shattered the boundaries of what a woman could be. She had ruled longer than most emperors, wielded power with a brilliance that eclipsed all rivals, and reshaped the institutions of the Tang dynasty. And in the memories of her people, she remained a figure of unsettling complexity. At once a visionary and a tyrant, a lover and a monster. Even centuries later, the stories of her decadence continued to circulate like ghostly rumors. In the tea houses of Chang'an, old men told of the nights when candles burned until dawn in her chambers, when young men with perfect faces vanished behind her silk screens. They spoke of her insatiable appetites, how she devoured every pleasure with the same ruthless hunger she brought to politics. And in those stories, she never truly died. Historians argued over whether her reign was a triumph or a catastrophe. Some praised her for breaking the suffocating grip of aristocratic clans, for bringing fresh talent into the bureaucracy, and for stabilizing an empire that might have collapsed without her iron rule. Others condemned her as a usurper who stained the mandate of heaven with cruelty and lust. But the truth, as always, was not so simple. Zetian had been born into a world that told her she was nothing, less than nothing, a disposable ornament in a man's palace. She had climbed from concubinage to become the most powerful woman in Chinese history. Along the way, she had shattered every convention, defied every taboo, and proved that ambition, when paired with brilliance and audacity, could conquer even the most unassailable of thrones. In her story, there was no redemption arc, no softening in her final days. She remained fierce until her last breath, unwilling to be pitied or forgiven. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more.